Hi, I'm Ryan Unks, and I'm a second-year integrative conservation student through Warnell. And I'd just like to thank all the organizers and to you all for being here today. So I'd like to emphasize that this is not, although I'm using ecological and social methods, I'm not really going into depth on the methods in this talk. I'm just trying to emphasize the integrative aspects of my research as I go through this. So just to give you a brief overview, I'm going to go through my background and framing, and then my research study site, and then go through the framework and methodology that I've chosen to address some issues there. So pastoralism, which can be thought of as gaining the majority of your livelihood from livestock, is considered the most suitable practice for a lot of areas in East Africa that don't support agriculture due to lack of rainfall. And it supports about 3.5 million people in Kenya currently. So there's a strong history of polarization with regard to pastoralism coming from the contrast of ecological and social views, social scientist views. There's a lot of polarization there, and also between development practitioners and social scientists were very differing views on pastoralist ecological dynamics, and also acknowledgement of pastoralist institutions. So just a little bit about, oh, what happened there? Did I hit this button? Oh, sorry about that. So just a little bit about semi-arid ecology. Rainfall is the main determinant of productivity in semi-arid lands. And so there's spatial heterogeneity of resources due to spatial rainfall, variability of rainfall year to year and season to season. And so access to these resources, and by resources here I mean forage across the landscape, is really important for wildlife as well as pastoralists trying to make a living in these lands. So a lot of pastoralist herding characteristics are thought to be very well suited to this environment. They're specialized breeds, and just to contrast pastoralism here with commercial livestock production. They're specialized breeds of livestock that tolerate drought, high heat, and migration. They're also focused on milk production rather than consumptive use. And so social organization of pastoralists in these areas frequently follow common property regimes. And by that I just mean regulation of a common pool resource, and referring to forage here. So the rules that structure use of this resource are built around forage access. And so the social authority is also reflects this in a lot of ways, and reflects a complex nested structure across the landscape, where councils of elders at different spatial scales can secure access, and there are also complex networks of reciprocity. So this, just to refer back to that spatial variability of rainfall, this map indicates here, well, I'll just point. The dark area has the lowest rainfall, but then also the lines indicate the coefficient of variation of rainfall, so that this central area, which is actually my study site, has the lowest level of rainfall in the area, and also the highest coefficient of variation. So what that means is that the variability of vegetation is such that the wildlife populations never achieve stability. So the vegetation is variable, and so are the herbivore dynamics. So the populations never reach what's known as a carrying capacity across the landscape. And the implications of this, it also has implications for degradation, where in the past a lot of times pastoralists have been blamed for degradation. But in fact, studies of this variability in rainfall have indicated that actually the vegetation change is more likely to change due to rainfall rather than degradation. And to add to that, the populations never reach such a density that they can damage the vegetation. So then this ecological understanding is reflected in the polarization that I referred to earlier, where a lot of development practitioners take this modernization approach to pastoralism, where it's basically an anachronism. The pastoralists need to settle down and begin farming or diversifying their livelihoods in other ways, compared to the alternative approach, which emphasizes the need for flexible institutions and access to resources. So I've been working in central Kenya, and this is Laikipia County, Kenya. So there's a long history of colonialism and marginalization in this area, where formerly this entire county was controlled by pastoralists, and now they're limited to this northeastern part in the bright yellow here, which is about 7.5% of the county. And so the colonial authority removed them to this area in 1930. And then there's a history of policies geared towards pushing pastoralists to become more integrated into markets and more geared towards producing commercial beef. So that's why these areas are called group ranches within this reserve, where the overall area is known as a reserve, and it's similar to a reservation in the United States sense, a Native American reservation. But it's subdivided within there, and the subdivisions are called group ranches, which refer to this commercial production of beef purpose, which will come into play later. But so the people that inhabit this area are collectively known as the Mukagota Maasai. This identity is contested and highly problematic, but I'd love to talk to you about that afterwards, but I don't have time to go into that right now. But this second bar from the left shows the Mukagota division, this entire area. And so it's among the lowest levels of livestock in East Africa. Also, there have been shifts in herd composition, where the herds are more composed of small stock, sheep and goats now. So a greatly different ecological pressure going on right here. But so to explain these subsistence struggles, a lot of people would take a Malthusian approach and say that population is driving the dynamics, population is leading to degradation. But if you consider the openness of the system in terms of population influx, historically and currently, and also the market influences on the herd dynamics, which are large, and also things like education that can be leading to changes in herding, you get a different set of questions. And so while I'm trying to take all those into consideration, I'm choosing to focus on changes in herding practices that are recent because I see those as the driving ecological change that's happened over the last 30 years. So these changes in herding practices are mostly being driven by access to private property, former access to areas around this reserve that are now private property, and also changes due to community-based natural resource management, where areas have become set aside for wildlife conservation, and it's also led to shares in profits from ecotourism coming back into the communities. But a side effect of this has been there have been formalization of areas that have led to decreased movement of pastoralists. So this is one of these group ranches that I was referring to earlier. And the pink shade refers to housing areas or neighborhoods, and the yellow areas refer to grazing areas, and the green areas refer to these new conservation areas that were started around 2002. So within the individual group ranches, the herding hasn't changed. There's this wet season grazing and dry season grazing. But what's changed is this outside access, when the forage is depleted on the group ranches. So this has changed in a number of ways, as I was saying before, but there are also implications for the rules about grazing access. And so a lot of these areas off to the side here have become monetized grazing access, where you have to pay to take your cattle there, leading to differential impacts on people of different wealth strata. So there are also novel hierarchically organized herding practices and a number of changes in norms of reciprocity. So what I'm focusing on is these explicit changes in spatio-temporal pressure on the landscape. So the landscape level process. So these are the mechanisms that I'm looking at, how this works with the timing of the pressure, as well as the sort of overall pressure on the land. Like that you can't just look at it from this former Malthusian way that I was talking about, but just looking at population pressure, you have to look at the timing, and also how this changes across the landscape. So the sort of mechanism that I'm considering as primary is this reduced movement leading to degradation of bunch grasses, tussocks of bunch grasses dying off, leading to overall reduction of the ecosystem function, or change in the ecosystem function. And so this coincides with work that my advisor, Lizzie King, has done on encroachment of succulents in the area, and also the structural patterns of rangelands, so the ecological function. But this work that I'm doing is sort of looking at these changes in dominant tree composition, as well as the loss of herbaceous and woody species that are being replaced by unpalatable species. And so an overall simplification of the plant community with the implications for ecosystem function. So a lot of people, or wildlife ecologists, are frequently focused on fragmentation of wildlife ranges. And social scientists in these areas have focused a lot on changes in pastoral ranges and the livelihood implications for fragmentation of that social process. So what I'm trying to do with this project that few studies have done is put that ecological and social understanding of the landscape together and to see what comes out of it. So I have three main questions that I'm emphasizing here, my three main research questions. So the first one is looking at this spatial changes in grazing practices. And the second one is looking at how these relate to changes in plant community composition. And then thirdly, I'm looking at the ecological implications as well as the social implications, and how this sort of possibly new understanding can lead to a rethinking of community-based natural resource management or other novel resource management. So, and then just a brief overview of the methods that I plan to use to look at this is I'm currently looking at changes in herding ranges using surveys. And I'm also using satellite analysis of vegetation changes over the last 30 years and planning to move on to more detailed plant community ecology methods where I'm looking at changes in plant composition as well as structural changes. And so this is just one example of a way that I'm looking at this sort of satellite-based land change history where this is low resolution 30-meter data. But the takeaway from this slide is basically that each one of these pixels represents a different change in vegetation, and to try to understand that vegetation in context of changes in herding ranges. And so then just to get at the implications, the third part of my question, I'm going to, again, use satellite imagery to look at basically forage availability and forage quality and differential household access to that forage resource. But then trying to supplement this overall ecological and social understanding by using ethnoecology methods to explore herders' perspectives of changes in the landscape over time. And not using this to merely incorporate into an ecological framework, and this is sort of a similar difficulty that I'm having to Emily, who presented before lunch, with sort of juxtaposing these different ways of understanding the landscape, the ecological versus the herder. But not giving either of them primacy necessarily, and understanding them both as partial. So in a way, using this to supplement ecological knowledge. And so finally, I want to do an institutional analysis of all these changes in the landscape together. So to kind of look at the overall implications and see what these implications hold for novel natural resource management regimes. Okay, and these are just my references. Thanks a lot.